So for the past 15 years, I have been building web applications. Lots and lots of web applications. Over 150 of them at the last count. It's not what I'm doing anymore. For the last year, I've been working solely on Kanbanery, but I have a lot of experience building web applications. And I was going through, most of them have been really great ideas, too. You know, when you're running a software company, you realize that as IT people, most of us, probably none of us, are in it solely for the paycheck. People want to build something beautiful. People want to build something brilliant. People want to build something that changes the world. So as the owner of the first Ruby on Rails web development company in Europe, I was looking very carefully at all of our prospective clients and only accepting ideas that I thought were really innovative from people who I believed could really bring them to market, because I wanted to have those great successes for my people. So, for example, how many of you remember the 2008 startup that allowed you to whip out your mobile phone when you went to a restaurant or a bar and check in to let all of your friends know where you were in case they wanted to come and join you? And you could share ideas, you could share comments on places like restaurants, cafes, and such. Get the Wi-Fi password to the coffee shop you're visiting, that sort of thing. You know what I'm talking about? Foursquare launched a year later. 2008, the exact same concept was launched by a serial entrepreneur with all the right connections in Silicon Valley, and we built it for him. I took a look last week. It's now a blog about ponies, and it's not active anymore. And when I was going over some of these hundreds of projects, not hundreds, 150 odd projects that we have done, especially all of those early ones that we did in the early days of Ruby on Rails, I found a lot of this domain for sale page. This was a brilliant idea. Should have flown. 404 errors. And so I started thinking, you know, every single one of these ideas had a lot of merit. Most of them have been turned into successful companies by somebody else. So what is it that we were doing wrong? Because I never took money from a customer who I thought was wasting their time and money. But all my focus had been on process efficiency and technical excellence. So I started thinking, especially now that I'm running Kanbanery, that I need to find out what it is that makes products more likely to succeed in the market, because it's not great ideas, and it's not brilliant people. And so I started investigating a whole suite of tools, and they're what I'm going to share with you today. A number of tools for identifying ideas and testing ideas, preferably as early as possible, in order to learn the lessons that you need in order to create products that people love. Because I know how things are done right now. I mean, I've been in Scrum, using Scrum for years. I've been using Kanban for years. And I imagine that web development is similar to other areas of software development. There's some person who is believed to be the font of all knowledge, some person who's got a perfect understanding of the needs of prospective future customers, or some person who fully understands what the stakeholders need. And that person takes that information and delivers it to the team in the form of a backlog, and then it is available to help inform decisions. But I also know from working closely with the software teams that what really happens is a lot of back and forth, give and take, negotiation, no, this isn't really possible or doable, and that in fact, most of the decisions that impact the usability of a product are made by the people who are actually doing the work when the time comes, because you can't ask the product owner everything, right? So, is that working? Okay. So, while I think it's great that a lot of product owners are getting interested in things like design thinking and design ethnography and more creative ways of understanding their users, they tend to come to the team in the form of some kind of finished work product, which is very simple. And the team very rarely gets to see any insight into how those decisions are made, or where these backlog items are coming from, or why they're doing what they're doing. And I think that they should be more involved, because they are the team that's doing the building are the people who know the product better than anybody else in the world, and they're all deeply invested in the product's success. So what I'm going to do, I mean, there's some tools that you probably are already using. For example, of all of the successful companies that we have helped to build, we've had 3 really big exits I wanted to share, because it's not all a sad story. We've had 3 really big exits, all of which had something really interesting about them, which speaks to the lean startup story. And that is that in all 3 cases where one of our clients had a big exit, what they ultimately sold was something drastically different than what they asked us to build. One of them was building a game that would allow Americans to bet on American baseball with their friends. It wasn't monetized because betting on sports is illegal in America. And it was eventually bought by the largest online betting company in the world, and you can now use it to place real micro bets on any sport except American baseball. Another one was a Gmail competitor, which was brilliant. It was faster, more intuitive, and had some great features that Gmail doesn't have. And it was ultimately acquired by Facebook and became part of the back end of Facebook's messaging system. And the last one was a guy who had the great idea that if companies are mining our social graph data and then using it to understand us better, maybe if users got involved in that process, we could generate better data and everybody wins. So we would mine social graph data and then invite people to edit their own social graph data. And that way everybody wins, people get more targeted advertising, or they get better offers or what have you, and companies get better data. But when he found that people didn't want to edit their social graph data, he didn't throw it away, he only threw away the front end. And we focused all of our efforts in engineering a great back-end solution, which ended up being acquired by one of his competitors because it was more efficient than theirs. And you can't really A/B test yourself into a pivot like that. And A/B testing is probably one of the most common tools that we use for validating ideas in our business. And I love it. I use A/B testing a lot. It's very useful for tweaking the sales funnel on Kanbaneri. But I have a few really big problems with it. The first is that an A/B test pits one of your ideas against another of your ideas. And in every single instance, I can absolutely promise you that there is some option C which would perform much better. And some of the tools I'm going to talk about now are tools that you can use to find that option C. The next is that most of them provide analytics for you, because we're not all statisticians. This is an A/B test that I ran. Oh, interesting, it's cutting it off. This is an A/B test that I ran a few weeks ago on 2 different landing pages for Kanbaneri, and the results were perfectly clear. From the very first day that we began running the test, version B was outperforming version A by nearly 4%, which is brilliant, because Kanbaneri's users tend to stay with us for years, and so every one of them is really valuable, and a 4% increase in conversions would be big money for us. The problem was that both versions I was testing of this page were exactly the same thing. It's called an AA test. It's a wonderful way to test your assumptions about how much you should trust your A/B testing software. And lastly, A/B testing is really, really, really expensive. And people don't get this at first. Why is A/B testing expensive? You can even use a tool like Optimizely, and you don't even have to alter your code to start doing A/B tests. And I say it's really expensive because you can't start testing until after you've poured thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars into engineering a product to run the tests on. So I'm wholly in favor of running tests as early as humanly possible, and A/B tests are kind of like the last tests that you can run. But we love them because they give us solid numbers. And that's what people in my field, I'm originally trained in anthropology, call the curse of Kelvin. And it stems back to this guy. He was an Irish-born English engineer, known as Lord Kelvin. He's the guy who the unit of measurement for temperature is named after. And during the scientific revolution, people were really excited with how fast we were learning things, specifically especially in physics and in electricity and such. And in order to compare data across countries and continents and test each other's experiments, we needed solid data and an agreement on metrics so that we could compare. And he was quoted as saying, if you cannot measure it, if you can't express it in numbers, then your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. And that's great when you're dealing with things like electricity, but when you get into more touchy-feely, fuzzy things, it becomes much more difficult, even if you're doing good research. And when you're doing good research with people and getting really good insights, but they're dismissed because you don't have the numbers to back them up, that's what we call the curse of Kelvin. For example, if I tell you from my experience that my son is ticklish, and I know this because he's 10 years old and I've been tickling him at least once a week for 10 years, and he always giggles. A scientist might say, but how ticklish is he? How are you tickling him? What units do we use to measure the ticklement, the ticklishness and the tickle? When does a tickle become a poke? When does a tickle become a scratch? And those are useful if you're talking about something like electricity, because those sorts of questions about, yes, you can make the sparks fly, but what does that mean? What's really happening? Led to ways of talking about it, like volts and ohms and amps. But if all you want to do is make my son giggle, then my meager knowledge is perfectly satisfactory. So I'm going to talk about other ways to get some more qualitative data about what's going on in your market and with your product and with people. And to do that, I'm going to use a variation of a model which was designed by Liz Sanders, who's a qualitative researcher working mostly in the medical field. And when she was trying to define the state of design research several years ago, she created this model that basically places, oh my goodness, you can't see it. All right, it basically places, it has one axis, the x-axis is for models that are more based on the idea that we have all of the answers, to models based more on the idea that it's through participation with users and real people that we can get the best data. And then from the top to bottom, it's got, I'm going to make sure I got on the right side, design-led and research-led. So most of the ideas come out of the research, and at the top, most of the ideas come from the design team and are tested down. And what I'm going to do is just a little bit different, and that is, nice, did you fix that?
No, he did.
Oh, cool. Is to make a little change to this model, which I think is more relevant for my business, which is on the x-axis, we've got the answers, and we're going to test whether we're right. Two, we have to work with them to get true insights. And then on the y-axis, from cheap to test, not very expensive, we haven't invested very much yet, to high risk, high expense. And as I go through some of these methodologies, I'm going to place them where I think they fit on the chart. Now, an interesting thing that she observed, which is appropriate to mine as well, is that moving up and down on this chart has a lot to do with your context. It's just a function of your product life cycle. So, for example, in the early days, here is where you're generating ideas, and here is where you might be testing prototypes, and over here is where you're tweaking your final work. But moving side to side is a cultural shift from having an inherent belief that we have the answers and we just have to find the right way to present them, to a willingness to get kind of dirty and uncomfortable with other people to try to explore potential solutions that we haven't even conceived of yet. And so any given team will use a set of tools, but they're going to be very uncomfortable moving side to side in this model. So I'm going to go through the first ones really quickly. We already talked about A/B testing, and I'm not going to talk very much about tools that you're already familiar with. Also over here on the we have the answers and we just want to test and see what people are doing with it, I'm going to put all of the web analytics stuff. I find it very useful, obviously. I use flow metrics a lot to find out where we're losing people and to measure whether or not changes that I make improve the retention and the flow of users through the system. But we're still talking about really expensive methods of validating ideas. Now, something that I've been doing a lot of lately, which I really am enjoying and getting a lot of value out of, is I'm using Hotjar. There are other tools out there as well, to survey users, and it's awesome. Combinatory users are really, really helpful. If there's something that I want to learn about what they're thinking or what they're feeling, I can throw up a survey go home, have dinner, go to bed, wake up in the morning and have 50 to 100 responses. And I like to use really open free text surveys to collect a lot of qualitative data and to give users an opportunity to express themselves in their own words. So one that I've been running for a while asks people, tell me little bit about yourself. Obviously, I ask things like, how did you find out about us? One of my favorite questions on this survey is, you've got the ear of the CEO of Kanbaneri. What would you like to tell me? And I get lots of very interesting ideas in there, from praise to criticism to advice. And the neat thing about this is a lot of people provide their email addresses for feedback, and those turn into interview opportunities. So if you have trouble trying to find customers to interview, this is where I find a lot of the customers to interview, is I start with these, and it gives us something to talk about. And what I've learned from doing things like this has been really useful. For example, I've learned that none of our users call themselves users. I can't find any instances of people voluntarily using the word users. And so we virtually eliminated it from our application and from our communications. They call themselves people, team members, boss, wife. And also that they don't call Kanbaneri or applications like that applications, or SaaS applications, or web applications. Over 90% of them refer to them as tools, which I wouldn't have thought. But I can change my messaging to better fit the way people actually think and speak about the product. But the tricky thing about gathering lots of qualitative data is you have to do something with it. And it turns into reams and reams and reams of paper documents. And so what qualitative researchers do is they put data like this into a qualitative data analytics tool. I'm using something called TAMS Analyzer because it's free and it works on Mac. And every single time I do an interview with a user and I have it transcribed, or I get an email from one of our users, or I get a bug report from one of our users, or I get a survey responses from a user, I put them into this tool. It can handle many, many, many files. And I go through and I tag it. Like here, for example, you can see I'm using the tag alternative. Anytime people are talking about something that they might use instead of my tool, or competitors of mine, I tag it that way. I've got tags like things that people like about Kanbaneri. When people are expressing pains, or talking about problems that they have, or talking about themselves and other people, or stuff that they wish we had, or other tools or products that are in their environment, I tag them as complementary. And what I can do then is I can go and I can generate reports based on these tags. So in order to avoid the recency bias, for example, instead of just when I get feedback that seems really jarring or that I really want to act on, I can go and run a report that shows me every other time somebody else has been talking about a problem in their environment, and put it all together and look at it in one place to start looking for patterns. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about other qualitative tools. All of it ends up going into a tool like this for analysis. So yes, surveys, I'm still designing it, but they can be done rather earlier, so I'm going to stick that down here a bit. Usability testing, also one of those things that goes up here reasonably high because you've got to already have a product to usability test, although you can do it with prototypes. Usability testing is fantastic because it's cheap and generates really useful insights really fast. You can either do it by giving a person a set of tasks and watching them complete it, preferably videotaping it so other members of the team can see what's going on. Or you can do it remotely using a tool like usertesting.com. This is sometimes called user testing, which I hate because we're not testing users, we're testing the product. But one of the things I like about it is Jacob Nielsen wrote a paper back in 2003 in which he demonstrated that you can find over 90% of your usability issues with just 3 to 5 user tests, which makes this a really great way to get useful data for how to improve your application quickly and cheaply. So I strongly recommend doing a few usability tests frequently, depending on how fast your product is evolving. This is another useful tool, card sorting. It's used by information architects when you're trying to figure out how people categorize things. And the most common use case is if you've got a complex website that has many, many pages, or if you've got an application that has many, many features that needs to be accessible to users, and you're trying to design navigation for it, you can put all the features on cards, or all the pages on cards, and invite people in and give them the freedom to sort the cards into stacks that make sense for them, and then label the stacks. And once you start seeing enough consistent patterns in the way people do that, you can design more intuitive navigation around it. So since in this case, the users have more influence, but you're still providing the content, I'd put that around here. Prototyping is mostly used for getting an okay from stakeholders or as a preliminary step by designers to get feedback from their clients. But they can also be really valuable for getting feedback from users. And that's because if you show a polished, finished product to somebody and ask them what they think of it, they're highly likely, they can see that you've put a lot of effort into it. And so they don't want to be too critical of it. And they don't really feel like they have much control over the outcome. You're not going to make any big changes to something you've invested a lot in. But if you give somebody something that's rough on paper with maybe post-it notes representing some of the features or aspects of the application, they're much more likely to say, no, that doesn't make sense here. I'd rather have this here, and sketch it in. So you get much more valuable feedback. You can also use prototypes, electronic prototypes, using a tool like UXPin, a Polish company, makes, to do usability testing on prototypes, which can be a fantastic way to get early feedback before you've spent much money at all. And then, of course, one of our favorites, interviews. The tricky thing about interviewing is that I've found, after doing many interviews, that people tend to be really good at identifying their feelings, not so good, but pretty good at identifying problems that they're trying to solve. They're not terribly good at all at really understanding the underlying needs that make those things problems. And most of them are really, really terrible at designing solutions. But when you're interviewing them, they tend to come at it the other way. And whenever I'm talking to users of Kanbanuri, it's always, I wish it had this, I wish it had this, I wish it had this. And so the most useful interview technique that I've found is to remember to keep people talking about themselves, not about the product. So when they start making requests, I ask, well, why do you need that? Explain to me the scenarios in which that happens. What kind of demands are placed on you that makes that necessary? How are you dealing with it now? What does it make you feel like when that happens? How are other people dealing with this? Maybe get them imagining, how would you solve that problem if Kanbanuri didn't exist at all? And in this way, I can get much more useful information about the actual problem to be solved, so that I can then compare that to many, many other people having similar problems and design a solution that suits all of them. Most of my interviews are done by phone, but of course, it's fantastic when you can do it face-to-face, but most of our users are in the US. You've probably all seen personas at some point. You may be using them. The most useful thing about them, I find, is that it reminds the people who are doing the development that they're not developing for themselves. That as much as they might have in common with the people that they're developing for, there are also differences. So personas represent the people that you're building the software for, and it helps the developers to think, well, now that's how I would solve this problem, but what would Tom think about that problem, that solution? And they're not easy to do. This is just some of the self-descriptions I've gathered from some of Kanbanuri's users. And you can't really design a persona that somehow represents all of these people. But what I'm working on doing right now is trying to find enough patterns to reduce this down to half a dozen people, perhaps, so that when I'm innovating solutions, I can think about how it's going to affect these very different groups of people in such a way that I make as many of them happy as possible. I have to add competitor analysis here because it is a very commonly used tool, and it's cheap and easy and can be done at any stage in the process. But it's also dangerous, and whenever you're doing especially a feature analysis of competitors, you should remember what we learned from the Standish's group's chaos report, that most of their features are poorly implemented and not used. So, but it really has to be here just because it's a very common practice, but it doesn't yield any valuable insights about your users or their problems, just an opportunities to explore. And then one of my favorite, ethnographic interviewing, in which you actually go into the user's environment, into their home or into their offices where they use the product. And the great thing about this is not only can you conduct standard interviews, but you can do role plays, you can do scenarios, you can watch them as they're actually using your tools in their environment. You can see them doing workarounds that are so natural to them that they wouldn't even think to complain about them. If, for example, you find out that your tool is used predominantly by people who are surrounded by kids who are making demands of them every 30 seconds or so, being in that environment, you might say, we should probably reduce the amount of stuff that's on the screen. We should reduce the number of steps that are necessary to complete a task. You can also meet the people who are making demands of your users and understand them in a much more meaningful way. It can be expensive, though, and can involve a lot of time and a lot of travel. Another technique for getting into a user's environment is diary studies. And in a diary study, I'll just give you an example. To do a diary study for Kanbaneri, for example, I might ask a bunch of my users and say, I'll give you a $25 gift certificate or an upgrade on your subscription or something if you'll just do me this favor. For 1 week, every time you open Kanbaneri, take a screenshot, and on this notebook I've given you, note the time, write down what you're trying to accomplish and how you're feeling. Or you can ask them to take a picture of their work environment every time they come in to the place where they're going to use your tool and send it to you. And in that way, from these screenshots, for example, I can see something that I would never see otherwise. What other applications do they have open? How does it look on their screen? Are they using it full screen, or are they using it in a window? Things like that you wouldn't get without being present, and you can get users to collect that data for you. So the reasons that I'm sharing these with you, there's a full map. These can move around a bit depending on context, of course. But the reason I'm sharing it here is because you, as the development team, you usually see only the ending work product of these sorts of techniques in the form of user stories or user interfaces. And if you know where they come from, then you might be more interested in participating in the process or asking questions about how it works and where these things came from. Because right now, where do most of the things on our backlog come from? The truth is that unless you've got a good UX team, most backlogs are a combination of somebody's imagination or intuition, the opinion of the highest paid person in the office, which we call a hippo, the last person a hippo talked to or blog post that they read, the loudest customer that you have, the biggest customer that you have. And the dangerous thing about this is that, as I said before, customers are really bad at solutions. In that great Simpsons episode, when the car company asked Homer Simpson to design the perfect family car, he did a brilliant job of identifying all the things that are frustrating about taking a road trip with a family. But the solution he designed was ridiculous. So, and of course, from competitors, they have it, so we have to have it too. I'll remind you, most people don't use most of the features in the most fully featured tools. I can't think of an application that ever became popular because it had more functionality than anyone else. The real trick is to do something that nobody else does, or to do something better than anybody else does. So I would encourage everyone to question your backlogs. Ask of each new feature, ask of each new product, where did this idea come from? Why are we doing it? What do we expect to accomplish? Why do we think that it will accomplish that? How will we know if it does? And in that way, become more involved in the process of designing software that users will love. Just to go back to my opening example, that company that launched a brilliant idea that could have been Foursquare in 2008 had almost the same feature set. The only thing that was really different was the relationship that people in 2008 had to their phones. These people didn't fully understand what people thought when they took a phone out of their pocket. And the only thing that changed between that launch and Foursquare was another launch that happened in between, which changed the nature of that relationship. So the reason why I think these things are important, I know that there's a lot of pushback on UX research because it's expensive and we've got a product to build. From my experience, over 150 products, many of which failed, I would just like to remind everyone that as expensive as research may seem to be, it's not nearly as expensive as being wrong. Whew, thank you.